One of the main reasons to draw flat garment sketches is so that it accurately represents the shapes of the body's proportions. To accurately represent your proportions, create your own customized croquis. This is the first step of personalizing your flat sketches so that you can envision those designs before you bring them to life. To start this process, download the croquis through the link in the description below. It is the same croquis found in the fashion design book. You will find the standard size version and the curvy plus size version croquis, just like there are two versions of the book. The croquis in the downloadable link includes the different lines for the head heights, and this just speeds up the process. The croquis is the template sketch that we use, and it's just a standard body. We want to customize it with your proportions. So to do this, we have to first take photos. There'll be two primary photos that you'll need, the upper portion and the lower portion of the front of the body. Let's go through the items that you'll need for this process. You'll want somebody to help take photos, or you can also use a tripod with your camera. I'll be demonstrating this with a tripod. You'll want to wear your undergarments, as long as you feel comfortable with the person taking photos and printing those out. If you don't want to wear your undergarments, make sure you wear something that's stretchable and very tight so that you can see the proportions of your body. You'll also want to stand against something that you can see the difference from your body to the background. So don't stand in front of a black background if you're wearing black clothes. As well, if you have something that's not dark, it does make it easier to see the shapes of the body. In case you wear clothes that cover up the belly button, you'll want to place a pin at your belly button so that you can see that in your photos. As well, if your bust, waist, or hips are not clearly defined, sometimes you can't always see those positions so easily, then you can also place pins in those areas. For example, the bust, I would place a pin at my high bust or apex area, just so I can visually see that in the photos. I would also place a pin at the waist if the waist is not clearly defined on the side. So to find the waist, you're bending side to side. Wherever you're bending, that's the waist. So you can place a pin even more toward the front a little bit so that you can visibly see that pin. Same thing on those hips, on the low hips, which is the fullest part of the body. Place a pin there if it's not easily distinguishable. And make sure you can see those pins in the photos. So if you can't, you can add a little piece of ribbon or paper or something there so that you can see it. When you take your photos, make sure your hair is up and out of your face so that you can clearly see your neckline and your shoulders. After we take those photos, you need to print them out. Now, definitely if you use Photoshop, you could do the same process digitally, but I show this version printing out the photos and going from there. We'll then go through and analyze those proportions and apply them to create your customized croquis. Let's get right to it. Before you take any photos, try to make sure your hair is tied back and as close to your head as possible. This is going to just help in the visualization process in drawing. So I have my cell phone and I'm going to be putting it on my tripod. I have placed the tripod height to about my lower thigh area, lower to mid thigh area here. And the camera is going to go at the top portion, and I'm going to be setting the timer on the camera because I don't have a helper for this. So let's go ahead and get that functioning using the timer, 10 seconds. So at this point, I'm going to be taking the lower portion of my body, then I'm going to be taking the upper portion of my body separately. Now, what is important for this step is that the camera is sitting upright. We don't want it to be tilted at all. So if you have a helper helping you, make sure that that camera is going upright and not tilting. That will make it distorted. Now I am going to be using my wonderful moulage dress form that I made, and she's just going to help me set it up because I just want to double check it. I don't have it so that the screen is facing me, just because I want a really great photograph. But if you're doing this by yourself and you don't have a dress form, definitely flip it so the screen is facing you of the camera so you can see. So right now here, I'm just checking the proportion, making sure that I have the full entire dress form in the shot here, and it looks pretty good. I might back it up just a little bit. I'm also aligning it with anything horizontal in the picture to make sure it's not going slanted. I'm going to bump it back because I don't have my feet to check the location, and I want to make sure I get my entire body in there, including an area for my head to be in there. I'm going to go ahead and place some tape on the floor just to get my feet in the same locations. If we're moving in and out of the shot, we want to make sure that we are getting those feet in the same locations. Okay, so I'm going to move her out of the way. And when we're placing our feet on the floor, we want to imagine the hip distance apart. And many people think that's out here, that you would place your feet at this hip distance. The hip distance is actually considering usually the center of the thigh of each leg at the hip area should be going parallel all the way down until the ankle of the feet. Center at the ankle, center at the top portion. That is hip distance apart. And I'm going to be using my tape in here to make sure I get at that same position. So now I'm going to go ahead and take a quick photo with that timer on. So we're placing the arms slightly outward because that's the shaping of the original Croquis in the book. The reason why we have those arms out is because when we're drawing flats, it's really helpful to be able to see the entire sleeve. So the next step is we're going to raise that tripod up to take the upper portion of our body. Now, if we are only going to take a photo in the middle portion of our body, usually the proportion is not exact and it becomes distorted, meaning the top portion might become a little bit smaller here and the lower portion becomes a bit smaller. So that's why we're breaking it up into two sections. Try to leave the tripod where it is, or if you have a person helping you, keep that person in the same location and simply raise the camera up. So if we kind of think of the lower half of the body, we positioned the camera kind of in the center. For this portion of the body, we are going to also get a little bit lower, portion it out between the center of the upper body. So between the hip area and the top of the head, you want to be in the center. So as those tripod legs extend, they become wider, which means I can't place tape where the legs are, but I'm going to be placing a piece of tape at the center pole on the ground so that I'm sure that I line up that center pole as it's taller. So I'm lining it up right to the front of that pole as best as I can. And now I'm going to be extending those legs. I'm going to go ahead and take my camera out. I have made a mental note on the position of the background so that I can get that background position in the same location next time. So now I'm making sure that center of the tripod is aligning with my little piece of tape down there. I'm making sure that the frame is similar to the previous frame in the width. Now, of course, the height is going to be different, but at least the width is similar. Okay, I want to make sure that the phone is going upright, which it looks like it's slightly tilting. We want to make sure that any horizontal things in the frame are aligned with the frame of the camera image. Okay, we're going to take the front picture. And I might actually close my lips for this one because I am going to use these for face images too. Now, when you're doing this, you want to make sure that your body is still relaxed. You don't want to have those shoulders raised or lifted. Make sure you're as relaxed as possible. All right, go ahead and print out the photos of yourself for the lower portion and the upper portion. Make sure you have some scissors, pencil, eraser, standard paper, and also if you have tracing paper, that's going to make it go a little bit easier to do some tracing. You'll notice in the free download that there are 3 croquis to choose from. You have the standard croquis found in the fashion design book. We have the mid-size croquis, which I've done as an add-on for people who are in the mid-size range. This is not found in either book. It's only with this free download and only here to help you customize your croquis. The last one is the curvy plus-sized croquis. This is the one found in the curvy fashion design book. You'll notice throughout this video that some of the proportions are slightly different on that standard croquis, and that's because I was constantly revising these croquis as I went along. So if you look at the head height and you think, oh, things are a little bit different, don't worry about it. As long as you printed it out at 100% scale and checked these little scales at the bottom of the croquis, you are good to go. Now, choose the croquis that you think is most similar to your body and continue with this exercise. So the first thing we need to notice is for sure the scale and everything is quite different from the printouts to this. That's okay. We are going to still use that as a reference, and looking at those photos we can really tell how different the perspective is from the lower portion and how distorted the head looks compared to the upper portion and looking at it straight on from the upper. So we're going to be taking the lower portion from this picture and the upper portion from this picture and taping those pieces together. Now to do this process, since I have multiple colors in my background, I am going to go ahead and utilize those different background images to align the photographs, and then I might go ahead and cut out my body. So I'm going to go ahead and start aligning the bottom portion with the upper portion as best as I can. And I'm going to use different parts in the background if it's possible. Sometimes the proportion is just so far off that it's not possible. So I'm looking at this and I'm trying to align those hips. Yeah, definitely not exactly possible to align the background images. So we can see, wow, that is a huge difference in the proportion of the location of the body and the background as well. But I think I'm pretty close. I've looked at the waist and tried to align those between the photos. I've also looked at the hip area, and of course that proportion is a bit off, but this would be more accurate hip location on the lower section. Another area could be kind of that high hip that we could align, but that is a little bit harder to identify that high hip location. I'm pretty good with that. If I take away the arms, it's a little bit easier to look at the body. And I'm going to go ahead and cut a piece together of the lower portion. We can see definitely those legs are slightly different between the upper portion and the lower portion. I'm going to go ahead and cut out the upper portion here from the hips up. Now, of course, if you have Photoshop, you can easily do all of this in Photoshop and it would go much quicker. I'm going to glue her together and I'm going to cut off the lower portion of the top. So I'm going to be using the standard croquis, and you can follow along whether you're using the plus or curvy size or the standard. It's the exact same process. Now we can see here on these croquis, these are 7.5 heads tall. That means the head height is 7 plus a half. Most croquis for flat sketches are between 7 and 8 heads tall, and generally with flat sketches, I like to go with 7 to 7.5 because that's more realistic to the proportions of most people. So we're going to find out how many heads tall you are. And we're going to apply that to our croquis that we've chosen. So with the tracing paper, if you have tracing paper, it goes a little bit easier. If you don't have tracing paper, you can also use standard paper. And if you can't see so well through it, you can also go right next to it to get the head height and the head width as well. Since I have tracing paper, I'm going to go ahead and use that. I'm going to just get a little corner of that tracing paper on here, And I'm actually going to glue her down to a fresh piece of paper. I also want to be able to know exactly where a few parts are on my body. So since I'm using all black in my garments here, it makes it a little bit harder to see. I know that the rise of my pants at the bottom here where my legs attach to my body is right here. And on my body, my belly button is slightly lower than the indentation on my side. I'm also going to outline kind of under the bust area here, and those are going to be some reference points. So many times when you look at the heads of different croquis, they might seem a little bit small, and usually that's because the hair is not considered in the height of the croquis. Since hair and hair lines are variable, it's very hard to get this proportion exact. So if you go through the whole process and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm 9 heads tall, it's probably because we're taking the face proportion in consideration with those photographs. So don't worry about it if you end up being 8 heads tall or 9 heads tall for whatever reason. It just means that we are taking the face proportions and not the hair into consideration. So this means as you draw your head, you're going to go to the hairline and just into that hairline. You don't want to go all the way to the outside edge of your actual head. The main reason for this is because the croquis that we're referencing here also does not include any hair. However, for whatever reason, when I measure the height of my face and I divide that by my total body height in inches or in centimeters, I come up with about 8.3 heads tall. Since the camera is a little bit not fully proportionate, we can't get it 100%. However, when I take my entire head height, considering to the top of my head, as if I were to scrunch my hair down, that adds quite a bit to my measurement of my head height. And when I take that calculation and divide it by my total height, I come up with about 7.3 heads tall, which if we look at the bottom of the floor where my ankle's hitting, it's right about there, 7.3. So for whatever reason, we're still getting somewhat of a proportional shaping here, considering that cameras can offer different proportions when we use the face height in this exercise. So using just a small piece of the tracing paper, I'm going to be drawing my face. So we're only drawing the facial part that's showing. I'm also going to draw the outside lines and connect them. So that is the height of my head, not including the hairline. And what might be helpful here is to just measure that head so that you know in proportion how tall that head is. Now you can either measure the entire body and divide it by that amount to find out how many heads you are, or we can just do it manually and get a nice visual display. So let's do it manually first. So I have my first height of my head, and I'm going to draw a perpendicular line all the way across my paper at the bottom of my chin. Okay, we're going to use that piece of paper, and you can use it behind your paper if you're able to see through that paper, okay? Otherwise, you could also cut out the head and use the head multiple times. It's also an option. All right, so I've cut out my head and I am going to continue tracing it. Now, of course, when you're using a pencil, it's going to look so much cleaner than my big fat marker. And I like to just have those heads on the side just as that visual cue. But of course, if you don't want to go through and draw them all in, you can just mark a little tick line for the height, and that's also okay. Okay, so I am around 8 heads tall with this exercise. Now, of course, the proportion of the camera can play into this a little bit, so it might not be 100% accurate, but it's pretty close. So then we're going to take a look at our croquis here, and we're going to be making adjustments to this croquis according to our new height and the width as well. We're going to be using that head as a measuring tool. We're going to use it in multiple different ways, including the half position and the quarter positions. I'm going to go ahead and use a fresh piece of paper, and I'm going to draw a new head on there just to give it a little bit more stability instead of tracing paper. It's going to be my measuring tool. Now, of course, you can also use math to do this instead of just doing it manually like this. And you would be using math by measuring the height of the head, dividing it by 2 to get the halfway point, and then also dividing it by 4 to get the quarter points. I'm going to fold this head in half to get my halfway point, and then I'm going to fold each end toward the center to get my quarter points. And these are just going to be reference lines for proportion, because we're measuring everything in heads, including the width of the body. So I'm going to draw those lines in so we can see them. So now my head is split into quarters. Let's draw the height of this head as a reference. So we're going to trace this head and cut that out. Then we're going to do the same thing, getting it in half and then in quarters. So we are going to be taking the quarters of this and comparing the positions of this, quarters or halves, whatever it is. So for the first position, I'm looking at my high point shoulder, which is kind of the bottom area of my neck, and I'm comparing this proportion to this proportion. So in comparing the two, we want to get a similar size ratio in order for it to work with the sketches in the fashion design book, just so it's quicker in sketching. And another really quick way to resize this dimension just to make it smaller to work with the fashion design book would be to make the outline of the body, then photocopy that outline and resize it to just shrink it down to be a smaller dimension, so that it works with the sketches in the book. Now let's go ahead and draw in this full head that's missing. Instead of going to the half now I'm going to be using the entire 8 to get to my 8 heads over here. And we're going to be stretching it out and widening it wherever it's necessary, keeping now this new proportion as best as we can to this. We're going to use this as a measuring tool for both the width of the body and the height of the body. And we're going to use this measuring tool for the same exact process. So the first thing we're going to do is look at this high point shoulder area based on where it's at from the top line. So look at your little head ruler, and mine is about a quarter. If it's slightly less, slightly more, just make a little tick line or mark where it's at and reference that in comparison to this head. So mine is right at a quarter. This is really close as well, so that's a good one. I'm clear for that. High point shoulder check. Let's check the low point shoulder, which is over here, slightly a little bit more here. So I am right between my quarter and a half, so 3/8 or a third, I should say. And that's actually really close as well. So that's also checked off. If it was higher or lower, I would just make a little mark where I need it to go, if it needs to go higher or lower. And I would do it on both sides just to get that visual. We're going to go through all of the length things first, and then we're going to go through the width things. So the next thing I want to do is look at that armhole position here and compare where it's at compared to this one. So my back of my armhole is quite a bit lower than this location here. This one is above the line, or right at the line, I would say. And mine is below the line, even though the front is much higher in the crease. I'm looking at the back a little bit more. So if I take my head here, I'm slightly less than a quarter, and over here, I want to be then slightly less than a quarter. It would bring it down right about there. That's my proportion for my new armhole position. Then I want to look at my apex, my full bust, which is right about here and here. And I'm going to measure that down. I'm right about 1/8, which actually is quite good compared to this one. Then let's look at the indentation on the waist if you have one. Some people are more straight here, so it's a little bit harder. If you have your belly button showing in the image, hopefully you do, then you can also reference your belly button location. And if you have any kind of other curves in here, you can also reference any other curves that you might have to reflect onto the curves of the body here. So my indentation is about 2/3 of the way down my head, just actually slightly lower than this indentation here. So I would say this is then my waist. I'm going to draw that actually on the body a little bit more to indicate the waist height. So waist, this was high point shoulder, this was low point shoulder, this was armhole, and apex. All right, the belly button for me was really close to that other line, so I'm going to draw that in here. Now, the big difference for me is that low hip. I have a really low, wide hip, which is at the bottom of my fore. So this is where my proportions are really changing now compared to this. So I'm going to draw the widest part of my hip is down on this line here, pretty close to it. Actually, it's even slightly below that line, proportion-wise. We can even go slightly below low hip. Now, if you had a high hip that was more pronounced, you could also go from that high hip and mark it here. Then we're going to go to that crotch point as well over here. I'm going to mark down how low that is compared to this. Definitely much lower on here. So this is definitely a shorter torso compared to where I am. And it is hard to see that exact line, but I think that's pretty close. Now we're going to look at that knee position, and we're going to look for the area that protrudes slightly and look where that location is on the inner leg. And I'm right about halfway down, head 6. So that's really here. My leg's stance is definitely wider here than it is here. And this is definitely up to you whether or not you want the wider stance directly hips above. I suggest to start with feet placed hip distance as a starting point, because that's really great for wider leg pants too. But sometimes when you're doing dresses, it can look a little bit too wide-legged. So this one is definitely a little bit more narrow here so that it looks good with more different garments. And that's up to you whether or not you want the leg stance to change. So I have here, half here. So this is protrusion, inner knee. Then we have the calf. So the calf is really the widest point here. And the widest point here is on my 7. And that is about 1/3 of the way down. Calf. Then I have my ankles, which are about 1/8. Ankles are 1/8. And then the feet are here. So at this point, we need to then check the width of the body and compare the width of the body to our heads. So I'm going to take one width here on the shoulder width, and I'm going to find out how wide this is. It's a little bit hard to find the exact ending of that shoulder sometimes. We can also see any sort of discrepancies in the highs and lows of the body. So my wearer's left shoulder is definitely lower than the right. So then using the head from this one, I'm going to compare that. And I'm actually pretty close in that shoulder width here, so I'm okay there. So this shoulder width is a little bit subjective on where it ends. So just do your best with this one when you're comparing your photo to the Croquis. And if it helps, you can fold your head height in the length of the head. And that way we can kind of get another sense for that measuring tool. So let's say we're going from here and we're measuring the width. It's around 1.5 heads wide on this Croquis. Now let's say you have 1 3/4 on your photo. That means that difference between this one of 1.5 and 1 3/4 is 1/4. You're going to take half of that amount and give it to each side. And vice versa. If you have smaller shoulders, let's say you have 1 1/4 on your photo and you're going from 1 1/2, we're going to take half of each quarter, which is 1/8 of a head, and take it off of the width. So you're adding and you're taking on both sides half of the difference between your photo and this example. The next thing I'm going to do is check the bust. Now the bust on this one is a little bit tight because I'm wearing a bodysuit. So I would come out just a slight bit more because of that bodysuit. So I'm 1 and slightly more than 1/4. And that's a pretty good bust. If your photo is different from this width, you're going to give half of the amount on each side. Even if it goes into the arms a little bit, that's okay, because you need to get the width that you need. We can always bump those arms out a little bit further when we get to the arms. So if you need to go bigger than this amount here, it's a little bit more than 1 1/4 here. If you need to go bigger, let's say we're going up to 1 3/4, that difference of 1/2 of a head, we need to give 1/4 on this side and 1/4 on this side. Even if it's going into that arm, it's okay. And vice versa, if you need to go smaller, you're going to take it off equally from each side. Now for the waist, let's look at the waist indentation. And I'm about 1 1/8. So this I definitely need to come out a little bit more. Come out to 1 there and then add a little bit more for that extra 1/8. And I'm going to do it right at the same location as that waist horizontal line that I did. Next thing is that hip. About 1 3/4. So 1 3/4. So I definitely need to come out a little bit more on that hip. And then any other things that you want to double check, like the thigh width. Definitely will make mine bigger here. For the leg portion, you only need to mark 1 leg because we'll mirror it to the other side. All right, I'll also cross-check the arm, the bicep area. And checking it, the length can be a little bit hard because the arms are out a little bit more. But if you have any differences, you can always mark that based on the proportion as best as you can for those arms. So usually the arms, when they're down by the side, are hitting somewhere in the mid-thigh area. So we can kind of see that ratio there. So here, slightly up. I think I'm going to leave those arms for that proportion and see. All right, so we've more or less marked those ratios on here. Now, visually, you can go through and sketch and draw in those lines now to get a similar proportion as this. You only have to do it on one side of the body though. You don't have to do it on both sides. It's going to be kind of like a connect the dot type of thing. Use any sort of tools that you have that you want to make it look a little bit more similar to these shapes here. So we can see we have really roundness here versus I have very straight here. So we're going to try to mimic similar shaping as well. So for here to here, I'm going to go slightly curved, but not nearly as much. And then to the bust, we're going to smooth up toward the bust. And we're going to really get those curves in there as best as they are. I am going to bump the legs out just a slight bit here, and I can measure the width of the leg in this area here. This is the width of my thigh, and go in the half measurement there. So this is the guideline for hips distance apart for me based on my new thigh width. I'm doing a perpendicular line from the center of the leg all the way down, and that will hit the center of my ankle. Of course, the closer you go to this croquis, the easier it is going to be to use the book. And visually, when the legs are closer together, they do look better for dresses and skirts. If you're doing lots of pants, having them further apart can be nice too. So then I need to bump this width out. So the width of my knee was once again from the protrusion to the indentation over here, slightly more than a half. So I'm going to take that slightly more than a half, get to the center of that pretty closely, and that's going to be my width of my knee here. So that's the indentation over here, and we're going from that to this. Then that calf is slightly more than a half. And the ankle. And my legs touch for quite a ways here, so I am going to consider that. And after the protrusion, it indents slightly. And then it comes back out for the calf. And you're just looking at the shape of your leg and considering how is that different from this sketch. Now definitely the foot is not looking as long because it has no high heels on. If you were doing some sort of fashion illustration, it would definitely be a taller foot for those high heels. All right, so the lines that I just drew are the most important lines that we're going to be using to trace it onto a fresh piece of paper. So if you don't have tracing paper, you will need to use some sort of marker to outline those so that you can see through it. And I'm going to go ahead and trace it onto a fresh piece of paper. As you trace this, if your lines are really hard to see, you can either use whiteout to cover up the old lines or use any sort of marker to help pull the lines through. And I'm ignoring the old croquis lines as I do this. So I'm only taking my new proportions. I'm going to draw that hip line there to see how far off I was. It looks like my legs are coming in a little bit more. Now I am going to go ahead and draw in the undergarments a little bit better and the reference lines. So the bra, and I'm only going to do half of it. And I'm moving the croquis upward now to get anything or adjusting the position of anything for the undergarment lines. All right, so I am now through with that exercise and I want to draw the center of my croquis on here. And I'm going to draw a line all the way down the entire center of this one. I'm going to reflect that onto my tracing here, getting it in the same line. So now I need to reflect it all to the other side. And to do that, I'm going to fold it with the pencil marking on the outside, fold it right on that center. Now we can see that my ankles are slightly off-centered here. So if I wanted to kick it out, I could a little bit more to be more like this stance, but I think I'm okay with it. We're gonna keep it how it is. And now we're gonna go ahead and trace the other side onto this side so when it opens, both sides show. Now at the point of drawing the bust, I do a double check to make sure it's looking good with the proportion. And that's looking okay. Looks like I could slightly move in a little bit more toward the center. Spacing is a little bit wide, but that's okay. Okay, I'm just going to do some final checks here about the comparisons of the two. For sure the arms are more closer to the sides in this one compared to this. That's totally fine. The stance is slightly wider here. Totally fine. I don't want to move the arms out any further because this is a good amount for the book, for utilizing the book. I want to just double check anything else that might look slightly different. For sure, proportion wise, you know, we still have the hair here to consider. So the head is looking a little bit small here. Usually it does until we get the hair in there. The curvature here, I think I can come in slightly more here. Maybe protrusion is slightly too much on the knees. But just doing some comparisons here, I would say also the width of this, I could come out slightly more or come in slightly more to exaggerate that curve slightly. So I'm going to go ahead and make those quick updates. All right, this is what I'm left with, and actually just looking at this image, this is so much more proportionate than this is because my hips are generally much bigger than my upper torso area. I have really narrow shoulders, and even in doing this exercise, I can tell that these proportions look really good to me. The camera angles make it a little bit harder to see those proportions sometimes at the end. This is reflecting my body type much more of that pear shape, a little bit bigger in the lower section and a little bit more narrow of shoulders. Congratulations, you have just done the work of customizing your own croquis. So now I have my customized croquis on the tracing paper. I've made a hand-drawn copy of that just to get my hands loose in drawing. And whenever you're making a copy over something, try to keep the hand loose. Don't try to go exact perfect. Keep the hand loose, go at an angle, and turn the paper as needed in order to really get the curves and curve and soften your hand as much as you can. The same thing goes with using markers, especially for outlining markers. If you go directly down and point using that marker, you'll end up with lines that are just not smooth and nice looking. So turn the paper as needed whenever you're tracing something and loosen up that hand. So I've made a hand-drawn sketch, then I've used my photocopier to make a copy of that, which is this one, and I'm using the marker on that. And the great thing about that is you can get used to using those markers as outlines. It might take a couple trials until you're pleased with how that marker looks as an outline, and you can always go back, make a few more photocopies, get used to outlining with markers, and once you're used to it, then that hand is a little bit more looser. The other thing is one of my drawing teachers at FIT would always say, don't feather the motion. So to commit to it and go with it. So feathering means that you're constantly going and not making a nice, beautiful line. So it's like not really committing to it. And that is generally just a practice, that it takes a little bit of practice to really commit to the line and loosen up that hand at the same time. So you can see if I would have been more upright, that line would not have been that smooth. And I'm going to turn that sketch however I need to turn it to get a nice, beautiful shape. That's what we're looking for. So I have a little bit of a mistake right there. We can see I can just go ahead and thicken up the line right there. And I'll thicken up the line on the other side to make it look a little bit more even. So then we also want to make sure our belly button is there, any sort of elbow line that we want, the clavicle bones, and then some knee lines, just as a reference. So to draw the back view of your customized croquis, you're going to take a piece of paper and trace the outline of the entire sketch. Trace the entire outline of the sketch. The only thing we're going to change is the bottom. So from the ankles here, we're going to change that to make it flat toward the bottom. We're also going to change the undergarment. So you can reference the croquis in the fashion design book. And you can see here how the undergarments look, and do your best to mimic that shape onto your body. You can also trace it in parts and also mimic the internal lines as well for the knees and such. So to draw the hands, they are a little bit tricky in the back view. You would be best off tracing these hands here as best as you can. Now you will find different hand options also toward the back of the book. That we have this other back view hand here. We have other forward hands as well here. And the only other difference then is that instead of drawing the chin, I just leave it open right there because we're going to have hair in the back and such if you decide to draw hair. Then once you've finished those sketches, you are ready to put it into your book. So your customized croquis go here on the page. You can see mine visually looks bigger than the standard version here, which is totally fine and quite normal actually. Then we also have another page for customized croquis, and here you could place any fashion illustration croquis that you might want to put in here. If I've done this with a customized version of myself, that would also be a great option to put there for your fashion illustration croquis. So hopefully by now your homework for today is done. You've made your customized croquis and you can begin utilizing it with creating your flat garment sketches with the fashion design book. In case you don't have the fashion design book, it includes a library of silhouettes and style details that you can mix and match to create your own unique styles. You can find it on Amazon and most online book retail stores. Plus, there's a link in the description below. You'll also find many more videos just like this one, linked through the book through QR codes. I'm Gina Renee, and I teach online pattern making and design courses so that you can design and sew clothes you love that fit. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, make sure you've liked it and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.